Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a second. Hey, welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Carr. I'm the Chief Knowledge Broker for OCTO, Open Communications for the Ocean. And I'm very pleased to welcome today Jenny Liu from the Blue Nature Alliance and John Bohorquez with the Blue Economy Solutions Lab and the Conservation Finance Alliance. And they're going to be speaking today about MPA financing, what we know, and the launch of a new global MPA finance survey. So for this webinar, we're going to first have an introduction from Ginny and John, and then we'll move into a brief tutorial about how to fill out the survey from Ginny, and then we'll answer your questions both about the general concepts presented initially and the tutorial. So please stay on for the Q&A after the main presentations and the tutorial. And to send in questions, you can do it in two ways. You can type them into the Q&A panel of the webinar interface, or you can type them into the chat. And with the chat, you can direct things either just to uh, the Ginny and John and I by sending to hosts and panelists, or you can make it visible to everyone. We just ask if you're sending any comments or questions, make them visible to everyone, that you stay on topic and keep it professional. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much for being here today, Ginny and John. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for everyone for joining us. I really appreciate this broader partnership that we're doing with OCTO. So for everyone who's not aware, as Sarah mentioned, I'm part of the conservation finance team at the Blue Nature Alliance. As an organization, we're really focused on working with countries to achieve 30 by 30. Specifically, we aim to catalyze around 18 million square kilometers of large-scale marine conservation areas, and we do this in collaboration with governments, indigenous peoples and local communities and partners on the ground towards really achieving 30% protection of the ocean by 2030. So as to date, we have active engagements in 42 different geographies covering around 25 million kilometers square of ocean areas. And this is including both working with countries to designate new marine protected areas, as well as trying to improve the effectiveness of existing ones. And as we all know, developing marine financing plans and mobilizing resources for implementation of 30 by 30 is really essential. And so we have our conservation finance program where we work with these partners on the ground to develop and implement financing strategies and mechanisms across the world. From these experiences working with different countries, we've really noticed that the process to developing these kinds of MPA financing plans can be really challenging and very costly. There's a lot of knowledge, capacity, and resource constraints. And so we wanted to think more broadly about how we can consolidate some of our insights and experiences and share that with the broader MPA community to help navigate through the MPA financing process. And so in this spirit, we decided to launch a global survey last week in partnership with Conservation Finance Alliance and the IUCN WCPA Sustainable Financing Specialist Group. And we're excited to share more about kind of the context of the survey, as well as do a tutorial at the end, walking the participants today through what filling out the survey looks like. So that being said, we'll jump right in, and I'll pass it off to Johnny for this first section.
Thanks for the introduction, Jenny. And we're all here today because whether it's you're working with a locally managed marine protected area or a multinational or protected area that protects large swaths of remote areas in the high seas, all require financial resources in order to sustain their operations and to help achieve their conservation goals. And in the context of over 100 countries around the world having agreed to target 3 of the global biodiversity framework, also known as 30 by 30, the total estimates for what that's actually going to cost to sustain 30 by 30, not to get there, but to actually operate protected areas that protect 30% of land and sea beginning by year 2030, could be as much as $100 billion. And current estimates suggest that maybe globally about $20 billion or so a year is invested in both marine and terrestrial protected areas. But that's just one, that indicates about a funding gap basically of $80 billion, indicating that we need to increase investments in protected areas globally by as much as 5 times. And that's just one estimate. Some of the estimates for the financing gap suggest that we need to increase investment in protected areas by as much as $200 billion. So there's a lot of uncertainty in what the actual financial needs are for MPAs globally as well as locally. We also need to remember that those are financial estimates for both marine and terrestrial protected areas, and these figures aren't necessarily disaggregated for marine and terrestrial areas. Marine areas, there's even less certainty about what the actual financial needs might be. Projections for what the cost would be to sustain 30 by 30 in the marine context could be as much as estimates have ranged from about $1 billion to $1.5 billion a year to sustain 30% of the protection of the ocean to as much as $20 billion per year. So there's even more volatility there. We see a range of estimates across a whole order of magnitude here. Furthermore, a lot of the projections for the marine side of 30 by 30, what it costs for marine protected areas, even in recently published projections, are actually based on models that are in some cases over 20 years old, and therefore data that's over 20 years old. And so the context of a lot of marine protected area management and therefore finance has changed as far as the technologies that we have available. What do marine protected areas look like today? So we have a scenario where a lot of marine protected area cost estimates are perhaps based on data that's not reflective of marine protected area management today. And even themselves were quite uncertain. They had a wide range of potential results for both at the global level, let alone trying to project costs more locally. Next slide, please, Jenny. What we do know is that beyond the financing gap, what we do know is that research has consistently shown that the majority of marine protected areas are underfunded. So I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anyone. But not only that, having a sufficient budgetary capacity as well as staff capacity, which are two very correlated things here, are among the two most influential indicators of MPA success or effectiveness. So 2/3 or more of marine protected areas are currently insufficiently resourced as far as financial resources or budget capacity, and about 9 in 10 have insufficient staff capacity, as indicated by some of this recently published research. So more than that, in addition to the budget capacity, a lot of MPAs also don't have budgets, and there's a need to improve capacity for budgetary planning and financial planning for marine protected areas. And that's what a lot of this work that we're doing here is about. Next slide, please. So in order to help create a financially sustainable MPA, to raise resources and make sure that the financial planning is there, it's important to develop an MPA finance plan. As Jenny mentioned in the introduction, these can be quite resource intensive just to do in their own right, but financially speaking, and as far as personnel capacity and expertise. But they're critical to understanding what resource planning and allocation over time. And that includes a sense of what types of costs an MPA might incur. And there are three main categories of costs for marine protected areas. There are establishment costs, which can include any research, the research and design phase, really. So that includes any sort of capacity requirements for the MPA planning process and towards the implementation process, which can also include a lot of legal fees for the MPA framework itself, as well as any potential financial mechanisms that might support it, additional transaction costs, and also the purchase and installation of any stationary or mobile infrastructure, including surveillance vessels and things like that. There's also opportunity costs with MPAs, which is basically foregone income. For example, if fishing effort needs to be scaled back because of an expansion of a no-take area or something like that, and that can sometimes go into budget planning directly through something such as a fisher's compensation scheme to make up for some of that lost income. And then we also have what are perhaps oftentimes the most significant cost over the long term of the management costs. And that's particularly the case for marine protected areas more than terrestrial protected areas because of the difficulty of management operations in a marine environment. We also sometimes call these operational costs. And these can include personnel costs, which again is very important to have that adequate staff capacity, not just for salaries, but also for staff training, resources, things like that. And that usually should make up in an ideal scenario the majority of the NMPA's annual budget. There's also monitoring, enforcement, and surveillance costs, engagement with local communities, indigenous peoples and local communities, or additional stakeholders, industry, government groups, environmental organizations. Scientific monitoring is also an important one as well. So there's a lot of these different cost categories, but how can we expect those? For an MPA, it's very helpful at the beginning to have at least some degree of what those costs might look like over time. And they can vary depending on a lot of variables, including, of course, the area of the MPA, the cost of doing business or operations in the country that it's located in, how remote it is, distance from location from shore, whether it's no take or a multi-use MPA, among other variables. So a lot of the models that have been used for costing MPAs, a lot of the costing models or algorithms to date, have not taken, had a very limited set of variables that have influenced the results of those models. And that might be part of the reason why the results can vary so much, but there is an opportunity to develop a more nuanced understanding of how some of these variables can impact MPA costs and towards the development of a more complex MPA costing model. Next slide, please. And there's been a lot of attention, of course, on MPA finance, as we've seen goals to protect 10%, not 30% of the ocean, widespread funding deficiencies there. But they all kind of provide different purposes or can help support different needs. There are financial tools that can help with, not that maybe aren't directly specifically to marine protected areas, but towards more national level biodiversity finance strategies or plans, such as the biofin methodology, which is very helpful for that and dedicated to that more systems level and national level approach. There are MPA finance tools that are maybe dedicated towards certain regions, such as the Mediterranean Protected Area Networks tool. There are others that I've also been involved in the development of that have kind of helped with initial evaluation of existing MPAs, not necessarily new ones, and helping with the prioritization of different financial mechanisms. But as far as costing goes, and that's particularly important if you're thinking about expanding an MPA or implementing a new one, or if you're working or at the country level to cost out what a marine protected area network that protects 30% of an exclusive economic zone might cost. Those have been very limited to really two models for one for the establishment cost, McCrea-Strub from 2011, and the Bamford model from 2004. So again, these have been quite helpful, but there's an opportunity to provide a more updated perspective and potentially a more complex cost model that can help provide a little bit more of a narrow range of results to have more applicable costing results to help with the early stages of financial planning for a single or for a network of several MPAs. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jenny. Sorry, Jenny, you're on mute.
Thanks, Johnny. So it's really within this broader context that Johnny walked us through that we really are excited to partner with these organizations to launch this kind of global MPA survey. And the broader goal is really to just better understand like what is the current latest state of marine protected area financing and how can we expand access and accuracy of tools to make it a bit easier for countries or MPA practitioners undergoing MPA financial planning. And so in terms of the types of data that the survey collects, we really think about what is the current breakdown of annual MPA costs across these different cost categories. We also want to think about like what the different funding sources are and how different MPA sites are working with partners on the ground and communities in terms of in-kind support. And then of course, like that's just reflecting the current state, but that doesn't necessarily mean, as we know, like most MPA sites are actually insufficiently funded. And so what is that MPA financing gap in terms of like where we're at right now and what would be the ideal scenario to fully fund this MPA? And then finally, a lot of this analysis is contingent on like understanding how area, location, region impacts these costs. So we do also collect information on the WDPA ID number, and where that ID number isn't available, we also just want to better understand like what is the size and if you're able to share those characteristics. The target outputs, Johnny kind of already described, but it's three main ones, but obviously there's much broader applications for this data. But what we're really focusing on is one, developing a more nuanced MPA cost model. I'll show you a little bit in a little bit what that looks like, but it really allows users to input a variety of different variables. And then based on those variables, the model would provide a more nuanced range of what a starting point for an MPA cost could be, MPA management cost could be. The second area, and this is really us trying to incentivize and provide something back to participating sites, is for any sites that do participate, we'll also share back a customized benchmark report that compares the that specific MPA's financial performance to an anonymous set of regional and global peers to identify efficiencies or better ways to allocate funding more effectively. And then finally, as Johnny had mentioned, we really want to also develop a more nuanced understanding of what the global and regional marine financial gap is, especially thinking about from that global, how does it actually distribute across different regions and what does that look like for marine in terms of the contribution towards overall global biodiversity gap. I'm going to move on to the next slide. The next two slides are really highlighting what potential outputs could look like. And again, really encourage everyone to share any questions that you have about this overall initiative. And also when we get into the survey, feel free to share any questions in the chat and the Q&A section as well. But this is really showing what the MPA cost model in theory could look like. I will call out that on the left-hand side are our hypotheses around which variables have the most impact around costs, but this might shift. And the idea is that users would be able to toggle along these different variables, and then the model would output on the right-hand side both a rough range for annual costs that is, again, a starting point to be further validated, as well as a breakdown of projected cost categories. And the goal is to publish these tools publicly on the Alliance site and through Conservation Finance Alliance and other platforms. So the second slide shows like what this hypothetical benchmark report could look like. And so the first column in white here would be like my MPA or participating sites MPA. This is all dummy data, so don't worry about too much about the numbers. And then again, I'd be able to compare my spend per hectare per square kilometer to peers in my region or a global set of peers. I think what would be really interesting is looking at how the spend breaks down relative to peers. So if I'm spending 40% of my budget on equipment and only 10% on staff as an example, but I'm seeing that other peer sites are actually spending much more on staff. Are there opportunities for me to think through other ways of allocating the use of funds based off of these best practices? And then similarly on the funding, the distribution side or sources of funding, there's also opportunity to think about, okay, if there's other peers in the region that are accessing other sources of funding, is there ways that I could try to channel funding through those sources as well? Okay, awesome. So the next few slides are just timeline and next steps. So in terms of timeline on our end, we launched a survey last week on February 3rd, or maybe over a week ago now. And then we've been hosting webinars to just try to walk people through better context and answer questions about the survey. The survey, quote unquote, closes March 8th, but the link will stay live. We know that there's some regions like the LATAM who will be mostly on holiday this month. And so there's going to be ongoing potential for people to continue filling out the survey, continue contributing to this global effort. But I think that's when we'll really start cracking down and working through the analysis. Brief call out is that in early March, the Alliance is also launching a separate but associated marine workforce survey with the Marine Conservation Institute. And this is really just a six question survey that's trying to evaluate more like headcount and capacity questions. So we're approaching it more from a financial perspective, but they're more approaching it from an FTE perspective. From March to April, we're going to try to do the bulk of the data analysis, and then the goal is really to publish these tools before the end of the year. In terms of the target audience, it ranges from MPA practitioners, government leaders, NGOs, conservation trust funds, and others. Basically, anyone who's involved in MPA financial planning or can share the survey with a broader network. We know that the person or stakeholders who have visibility into this kind of data really depends on the country. So in some countries, that might be the MPA practitioner directly, and others that might be more of like a conservation trust fund. And our goal is to collect 100 responses at least, and really trying to get a data set that's representative of different regions, especially with the goal of doing that regional financial gap analysis. And then we'll also be doing a series of short qualitative interviews just to dive a little bit deeper into some of the insights and trends that we're seeing from the survey responses. So you'll have an option in the survey to opt into those interviews if you're interested in participating. So finally, before I jump into the survey tutorial, in terms of how you can support, first and foremost, participate in the survey if you're able to. If you're able to or not, share the Global Finance Survey to your networks via email, WhatsApp, and LinkedIn. We have this posted on our website as well as our LinkedIn, and it's also on the OCTO message board as well. We're already attending the February 13th webinar. I should have updated this, so good job, we've already done that. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Chris Stone and myself at the Blue Nature Alliance at any time. So our emails are listed here, and they're also listed in the survey as well as on any of the like LinkedIn or other platforms. Awesome. So with that being said, I'm going to shift towards a tutorial of the survey. If you do have the data available with you, would strongly encourage you guys to fill this out as we're going through it. And also if you have any questions on like, what does this mean? Why did you guys approach it this way? Feel free to share those questions in the chat here. So I'm going to share screen. Awesome. So this is the landing page for the survey. My main call out here is that the survey does take 15 to 30 minutes to complete. There's around 20 questions total. And we acknowledge that this is like very detailed survey, and there's maybe some survey fatigue within the MPA community with there always being so many surveys, but given the level of detail and nuance and global tools that we're trying to develop, we really try to think about like what were the most critical questions to ask to be able to do this kind of analysis. And then the other thing to call out on this page is that we prioritize data privacy. And so all individual responses will be kept confidential. They'll not be used for any other purposes than those that have been explicitly outlined and communicated. And then any collected data will only be used for aggregated analysis. The only exception to that is that with the benchmark reports, we'll be sharing that back to the participants. And so that does contain site level data, but again, that's purely confidential between the participating site. So this is the first page here. Call out for this entire tutorial is that I'll be using just like random inputs and answers. So it's not actually representative of any particular site. One thing to note for the survey and throughout is that the survey is designed to collect information at the level of individual MPAs. And so site level financial data for an individual MPA is strongly preferred. But there are, of course, countries that have conservation trust funds or an NGO that supports multiple MPA sites, and it's very difficult to parse out the site level financing. And so we do accept aggregate financial data, and you'll see on question 2 that there's an opportunity to indicate that. So with the first question around what country or jurisdiction is the MPA located in, you'll see that the first 2 options here are multiple countries and jurisdictions for transboundary MPAs, and there's also an option for high seas. If you were to click on multiple countries and jurisdictions, there is a follow-up question around, please just specify which countries are involved. And so I'm going to select an individual country for now. Let's say I'll just do Indonesia here. This next question is really trying to clarify, is this representative site level data or aggregate financial data? So you can see here, if we click aggregate financial data, a follow-up question pops up that just asks, can you please share more information about the MPA sites that are included in this aggregate? If possible, sharing the WDPA ID again is really ideal because there's already a ton of data collected on governance, area size, location. But if not possible, I think sharing basic information around the names and total area sizes is super helpful. So I'm just going to click site level financial data for now. If you do click site level financial data, we do have a functionality where you can actually search specific MPAs. So if I search here, Raja Ampat, you'll see that actually filters out. Alternatively, I can also search the WDPA ID directly. Sorry, my internet is being a little bit slow. Oh, here we go. And then if your MPA is a locally managed one or it's not listed in the WDPA database, you can also just select other for MPA not listed. And then again here, if it's not listed, we'd really appreciate some details around like name and area size. Question 5 is just what currency is your financial information for the rest of the survey being reported in. So I'll just select Indonesian here. And then we have a question around, does your MPA have an annual budget or budgeting process? You can click yes or no here. And then we also want to understand the complexity of like how different stakeholder groups are involved in management of the MPA. So we can click maybe the local government is the lead entity, and then others are involved, but not necessarily the lead entity, and some might not be involved at all. This question is thinking about the programmatic areas, so hopefully it's pretty straightforward. You can select all that apply. So I'll just select multiple here. And then to receive additional information on the results of the survey and also receive the benchmark report in response, we do ask for your email address. And then there's a question here of if you'd be interested in participating or receiving information on the MPA workforce survey that's being sent out in a couple weeks. And then, yeah, role and organization if you feel comfortable sharing. Okay, awesome. So the second page is diving deeper into just cost, better understanding the cost. And so this first question is, what is the total annual cost of operating the MPA site? We acknowledge that not every site is going to have 2024 data. And so you can indicate whatever is your most recently available years. So I'm just going to arbitrarily put 100 here. And then what is just indicating what year is this representing? So let's say this is 2019. In the next few questions, we'll be asked to break down, like, how does that $100 break down across different cost categories? There's an option to indicate this as a specific amount in the currency or a percentage of total annual cost. So I'll show you the specific amount in the total currency. Again, I'm just going to arbitrarily enter some things. So let's say this is like 50, half of the budget, and let's say 20 and 30 here. Alternatively, if you don't necessarily have exact dollar figures and you're just kind of providing, here's my best guess at what this breakdown looks like, you can also do it by percentage of total cost. So you could do 50% here. Again, I'll just put arbitrarily 20% and let's say 30% for scientific monitoring. And then you'll see the total at the bottom here. There's an option at the last row for others. So this can be anything from administrative costs, travel, conferences, workshops, things like that. And so we do ask that you specify what other is included, what other includes here. So this is the question around what is the financing gap for this particular MPA site for me to be able to adequately manage the MPA? So I can indicate just roughly we have 75% of costs and resources covered, or we have 25% here. And if there are like additional funding needs, we also want to better understand like what are the most priority areas that are lacking funding. So you'll be able to rank the top 3 cost categories that require priority funding here. So I'm just going to, again, arbitrarily pull in some here. And then you can also reorder these as you like. So I'll put staff salaries at top because that is as we know, the biggest financing gap for MPAs. This next page is structured very similarly, but it's focusing on the funding sources side. So again, you can indicate this as a specific amount, or you could do percentage of total funding. Let me just choose specific amount for our reference. So if you recall, we entered $100 in the previous module, and so we'll try to sum to $100 here. So let's say this is like $30 comes from domestic government level, 20 comes from NGOs, 20 comes from multilaterals, and then let's say 30 comes from domestic foundations and environmental funds. Again, if there's any others that you want to call out, please feel free to specify here. And then we do also want to understand like the level of in-kind support. And so if you click these here, you can select as many as apply. And then we also want to understand like who is actually providing this in-kind support and how significant is the support that they provide. So there's a couple options here, and you can just indicate the level of support provided here. So again, I'm just gonna arbitrarily select these for now. And that's really the core of the survey. There's some additional optional questions at the back end that just help us better understand the data. And so we can understand like what are the primary threats in terms of like how are they contributing to costs. Again, this is purely optional. If you do have any additional comments on feedback on the survey, further clarification on any of the responses that you provided, or any ideas of like what you would want to see this data being used for, feel free to share them in this comment box here. And then if you do feel comfortable sharing any files, there's an option to upload a file or share the link here. Again, we'll make sure that everything is kept confidential and anonymous. This is mainly for us to just kind of compare and contrast based off of the survey responses. And then that's pretty much it. So then you click submit, and again, you'll see our contact information here if you have any further questions or want more information. Awesome. So that concludes the tutorial part and everything that we wanted to share. Again, if you are able to share this in your networks, that'd be super helpful. But now we'll open it up to Q&A, and Johnny, Sarah, and I will look through the questions that have been submitted.
Thanks, Jenny. And we do have one question in already from an anonymous attendee asking, does the survey also capture how effective the MPA is in meeting its goals? If the ambitions or targets of the MPA vary, how do you understand how the cost and effectiveness are correlated?
I can tackle that question. I think that's a really great question because, as you pointed out, most of this targets like existing designated MPAs, so it doesn't really think about like what would it take to get to 30%. That being said, like our plan is to extrapolate from this data, like for sites that have reached 30%, here's generally how much they're spending, here's the economies of scale that we can expect. And so the idea is to use this analysis to think about how can we make governments more comfortable about what that ambition to 30% might look like. Johnny, is there anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, what I would also add is that the correlation between budget capacity and effectiveness or towards meeting conservation goals has been already highlighted in previous research, and so we're not looking to reinvent the wheel here. That connection has already been made. From a practical point of view, we understand that surveys take time, and so we're really trying to. It's already it's already quite robust, so we're just trying to be mindful of the amount of time that respondents are putting into this, and try to focus on really what are the core variables here. So that is definitely still an important question. There's opportunity for, I think, further research there on greater nuance on how different types of costs influence effectiveness and then meeting those. But the research has fairly well defined at this point that having sufficient budget, especially sufficient budget towards personnel capacity, is critical.
Awesome. And I saw that in the chat, Artemy, you had asked the question about will the webinar be recorded? As you had mentioned, it is recorded and it'll be posted on the OCTO website. We'll also be sharing this PowerPoint with webinar attendees, especially there was that page that kind of shows a landscape of existing MPA financing tools and resources. So if that's helpful at all, we'll make sure that that resource is shared for reference. Again, any other questions about the survey itself, or anything else about the broader initiative? we're happy to stay on for a couple more minutes in case any other questions come through. Sarah, is there anything that we missed in terms of things that we should mention that maybe we didn't cover yet?
I don't think so. I'm trying to think of the questions that came up last time. Let's see.
Awesome. And I just reshared mine, Kristone's contact information in the chat. So if you do have any questions at any point, feel free to reach out.
Mm.
We do have another question that just came in, and I'm reading now.
Okay.
From Nazrul, another one also just came in. We are an NGO, not the legal guardian of the MPA. That role belongs to the government agency. However, in the past 10 years, we have been actively involved in managing various aspects of the MPA, including system monitoring, education and awareness, and community engagement, effectively filling gaps left by the government agency. The agency primarily focuses on enforcement as it is their legal mandate and cannot be carried out by others. Given our extensive involvement, are we eligible to participate in the survey?
I would say yes, for sure. If there are like more complex dynamics that you're describing here, I would definitely add them in the additional comments because that allows us to contextualize like this is only maybe the partial picture and we want to make sure that we have the full picture before making any conclusions. But I would say that any stakeholder group involved with helping manage the MPA, helping manage finances, even if you're not the direct legal guardian, is definitely eligible to participate.
And certainly in cases where if the budget for the MPA is known by you or is public, for the as far as government resources, then that could be added on to the costs that the NGO is allocated. We did consider multi co-managed MPAs or MPAs that work closely with public-private partnerships. And if there are any that you feel are not best answered by you, but someone else, there are incomplete answers or non-answers to some questions are certainly acceptable. And if you can point us towards where perhaps we can help find answers to those, that would also be helpful. And there's also some, as Jenny pointed out, questions there as far as related to the degree of capacity that other agencies, including NGO like ours, contribute to the whole financial picture. We have another question here from an anonymous attendee. Is it possible to create cost per conservation target or strategy on the cost assessment?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Maybe strategy on the cost assessment. I think that'll be part of the resources that we share, and that's kind of what the cost model is trying to do. But in terms of like strategy of how you actually go and develop like a bottoms up detailed cost analysis, I think a lot of the resources that we shared early on in the presentation covers those steps in quite a bit of detail. Our goal with this model is to really just provide like what is a starting point for MPA financing for MPA sites to think through their financials or to think about like what their current financials look like.
I would also, I think, not necessarily conservation targets might be very nuanced to the MPA, but if by conservation targets there are certain areas to fulfill, including surveillance, enforcement, education and outreach, scientific monitoring, there are specific categories that are universal enough across MPAs that we think that for a global survey like this are appropriate. So certainly for certain types of programmatic activities, that's ingrained in the survey. And we can look at identifying, addressing the cost and the cost breakdown across those for a collective MPA budget.
A couple questions that came up in the last webinar, and you've covered this to some extent, but just talking about how the results will be shared and whether MPAs that are in the process of being established should fill out the survey.
Yeah, that's a Great few questions. So the results will be shared through email. So anyone that participates or is on the email list that received and through Octo will make sure to share the tools, reports, and resources. They'll also be posted on the Blue Nature Alliance's website, and then also through our partners at the Conservation Finance Alliance and any other partners who would want to share and publish this resource. And then Sarah, what was the second question again?
Oh, whether MPA is in the process of being established should fill this out as opposed to fully established MPAs.
Yeah, I would say that the survey is definitely targeted more towards management costs rather than establishment costs. That being said, like again, we value any kind of data that we were able to collect, but I would definitely indicate that in the additional comments. I don't know if you have
And
the same
so,
perspective, Johnny.
yeah, and that's the big financing hurdle for MPAs in the big picture. But there is also, just a reminder, there is also that opportunity to submit, to upload, or provide any links to any management reports, any publicly available budgets or audit reports, things like that, that could be helpful with this too.
Okay. Um, well, since we don't see any other questions, if anybody has anything, if you just send it in real quick. If not, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Jenny and Johnny. We really appreciate you coming on to show everyone how to answer the survey, to fill it out, and also for the overview of the state of MPA finances right now. And we look forward to learning more about, finding what you've learned from the survey in the months to come.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to all the participants, and thanks to you again, Sarah, and the Aqua team for helping us share this far and wide.
Okay.
Thank you,
And thank you
everyone.
for Yeah, and thank you everyone for attending and appreciate your help with the survey and we look forward to having you on future webinars. Okay. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye, guys.